We're here today to discuss the 2022 Air Quality Management Plan. This is the fifth of 5 regional public hearings we're holding on this plan. And before we get started, there's a lot of content, a lot of material we want to get through today before we get on to public comment. I do have a script I wanted to read through just to work through the logistics of the Zoom format itself. So I'll go ahead and get through this script now. We're going to do our best to facilitate a smooth meeting with public participation. We have 2 formats for participation, the Zoom web application as well as teleconference. Before we begin, I want to review some guidelines and general instructions for the meeting. For those on the panel, we ask you to please silence your other communication devices, such as your cell or desk phone. This will ensure that we are not hearing any feedback or causing interruption during the meeting. All participants on Zoom, except for panelists, will be placed on mute by the host. You will not be able to mute or unmute your line manually. At the end of the content that we'll provide today, I will announce public comment. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for public comment. We may provide a shorter length of time depending on the number of requests to speak that were received to allow everyone an opportunity to be heard. A countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. For those on Zoom, if you would like to make public comment on the Zoom screen, please click on the raise hand button. For those calling in by phone, you can dial *9 to signal that you would like to comment. Your name or part of your phone number will be called when it is your turn to comment, and the host will unmute your line automatically. Please note you can hang up and/or leave the Zoom meeting at any time. We ask, of course, that you please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being dropped from the meeting. Lastly, please be aware that this video conference meeting is being recorded. By participating in this meeting hosted by South Coast AQMD, you agree to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD. If there are any South Coast AQMD board members or the consultants who wish to be brought onto the panel, please raise your hands and we can bring you over. Okay, so we have a lot of material we'd like to get through today. We have several presentations lined up to talk about the Air Quality Management Plan itself, about the state implementation plan strategy that is a component of the Air Quality Management Plan, and then some important assessments and analyses of the proposed measures, control measures that are in these plans, including our California Environmental Quality Act environmental assessment, as well as our socioeconomic impact assessment. So a lot of material to get through, but we really want to hear feedback from the public. So we want to get through this material first, work through all that, and then we're going to pivot into that public comment section, which is very important as part of this process. So with that, I can go ahead and turn this over to our first speaker, and we'll ask our speakers to identify themselves as they go through to their turn on their presentation. So first up, we have Dr. Sang-Mi Lee. So Sang-Mi, if you could take it away.
Thank you, Ian. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Sang-Mi Lee, Planning and Rules Manager for AQMP. So the first presentation we have is brief overview of 2022 Air Quality Management Plan. Next slide, please. This lists the series of regional public hearings we're hosting for the development of 2022 AQMP. As Ian mentioned, we scheduled 5, and this meeting is the last one. Having said that, still there will be one more public hearings at South Coast AQMD's governing board meeting in December. So that the schedule will be provided at a later end of this presentation. Next slide. So a quick outline of my presentation is, first I will start with the background and about ozone air quality. We'll touch base on the NOx emissions projected for current condition and then future milestone years. And South Coast AQMD's control strategy, how to reduce the NOx emissions and achieve ozone air quality standard. And CARB's strategy will be presented in further detail by Sylvia Vandersbeck in the presentation followed by mine. And brief discussion of public process and the next steps. Next slide. So we start with the introduction who we are. We are local air pollution agencies overseeing South Coast Air Basin and Coachella Valley. We are the largest of the 35 local air agencies in the California and the entire nation. Our primary responsibility is pursuing emission reductions from stationary sources, and we are also responsible for developing clean air plans such as AQMP. Next slide. So AQMP is in general a blueprint to improve air quality and achieve federal air quality standards for the South Coast Air Basin and Coachella Valley. We have a series of AQMPs, and the current one, 2022 AQMP, is the latest of the series. So US EPA is responsible for establishing the standard for ambient air quality, and they also periodically review and amend the ambient air quality standard. The latest of their action was in 2015, when they strengthened a standard for 8-hour ozone to 70 ppb. That triggers the need to develop an AQMP. So this AQMP is addressing the strategy to meet the 2015 ozone air quality standard by 2037. Next slide. This photos here depicts the challenges we still have and also the progress we have made over last half of a century. While Los Angeles Air Basin has improved air quality tremendously, still we have the challenge, that is, we have still worst ozone air quality in the entire nation, and we are among the worst fine particulate matter pollution. Next slide. So quantitatively, this graph illustrating how much progress has been made in past 3 decades. Blue line representing ozone levels in South Coast Air Basin, red lines for Coachella Valley. While there have been progress, but still we are well above federal ozone air quality standard. There are 3 different 8-hour ozone standards set by US EPA, which are depicted here, broken black line. And the lowest one, marked at 2015, that is the latest one, and that is the standard addressed in this AQMP. Next slide. So we are looking into ozone air pollution and trying to improve the air quality, ozone air quality. That is because there is adverse health effect associated with it. Ozone is known to irritate respiratory tracts. That means it increases coughing, sore throat, increases susceptibility to infection, and increases the intensity or frequency of asthma attacks, and also aggravate emphysema and chronic bronchitis. In addition to that, the pollutants that forms ozone also contribute to fine particulate matter pollution, PM2.5, and PM2.5 is known to cause premature death. Next slide. Then the question is how to improve ozone air quality. And then we identified the emission reductions of NOx, nitrogen oxide, is the key to improve ozone air quality in South Coast Air Basin. Nitrogen oxide, or NOx, is formed during fossil fuel combustion process. And then we have estimated level of NOx emissions for the entire basin as depicted in the graph on the right. So the first bar marked as 2018, that's the total emission estimated for 2018, that is the base year. And then second one, 2037 business as usual condition, which is projected for 2037, that is the attainment due date. As depicted here, future business as usual condition is expected to have approximately 50% of current day's NOx level. However, this business as usual condition is still not sufficient to meet 70 ppb ozone standard. And this 2022 AQMP indicate that substantial amount of NOx reduction is necessary to meet it. In fact, 60 tons per day of NOx emission is the most amount of NOx emission we can still accommodate in the atmosphere while meeting the standard. That level is 83% reduction from more or less current day level, and 67% of additional reduction from future business as usual condition. Next slide. So this slide describes where the NOx emissions coming from. The pie chart on the left is 2018 condition, and the pie chart on the right is future attainment due date, which is 2037. In the South Coast Air Basin, majority of NOx emissions come from mobile sources. But in the future year, when you compare these two pie charts, the distinctive difference is the larger presence of off-road mobile sources depicted in the yellow category here. This off-road mobile sources includes aircrafts, locomotives, and the ships, and then some of construction and industrial equipment, and even it also includes lawn and garden equipment. Next slide. Then the question is, how do we reduce these emissions? Or even before that, who has authority to reduce emissions from certain sectors? We categorize here in the three groups: local and state authorities that indicate South Coast AQMD and CARB primarily, and federal authorities such as EPA. But then here this graph indicates approximately 1/3 of total NOx emissions belong to federal authority, federal jurisdiction. And that amount of emission belong to federal jurisdiction exceeds the maximum amount of NOx emissions we can accommodate to meet the standard. So this indicates federal action is critical to attain the standard. Next slide, please. And then this bar graph illustrates where the reduction should come from to meet the 70 ppb ozone standard. South Coast AQMD strategy will target approximately 32 tons of NOx reduction. CARB's measure, they have different categories. The sources under direct CARB's authority, and CARB's measures targeting locomotives and federal authorities. So Sylvia's presentation, the next presentation, will discuss a little more detail here. And then with all these plans, we're targeting to reach a 60-ton level, which will be the attainment level. Next slide. So we mentioned this, attaining this 70 ppb requires a substantial amount of NOx reduction. And it turns out that level of NOx reduction is beyond the level can be achieved through traditional approaches. Traditional approach meaning that typically the air pollution control was targeting cleaner vehicles, cleaner engine standards, cleaner boilers, clean fuels. However, the amount of emission reductions requires more innovative, more advanced technology, and wherever feasible, we need to shift to zero emission. Next slide. So with that the principle in mind, we developed a series of control measures that includes NOx control measures and pursuing co-benefits from states and other local agencies' greenhouse gas reduction policies, and strategic VOC measures and other measures. Next slide. So this slide depicts the South Coast AQMD's NOx measures from NOx measures that apply to stationary and area sources. Traditionally, NOx measures, again, focusing on large combustion sources. That is the last picture on this slide. That usually covers boilers, process heaters, refineries, electricity generating units. And this AQMP continues pursuing emission reductions from large combustion sources. But in addition to that, this AQMP also pursues reductions from residential combustion and commercial combustion, because each of these contributes to total NOx emissions and contributes to ozone pollution. Next slide. While South Coast AQMD has rather limited authority for mobile sources, we still have pursuing innovative approaches to even further pursue emission reduction from mobile sources that include facility-based mobile source measures, and then it also targeting the emission reductions from emission growth areas such as construction. Because of economic growth and population growth, there will be more constructions, but we are promoting clean construction policy, for example. We will continue implementing incentive programs to accelerate turnover to cleaner engines, cleaner vehicles, and then we also pursuing partnership with international and national agencies. Next slide. So this illustrates the public process we have been taking in the past couple of years in the development of AQMP that includes advisory group meetings, working group meetings, public workshops, and we also receive written comments from stakeholders. And then we are also communicating and collaborating very closely with the other state and federal agencies. Next slide. This shows where we are at with the AQMP development in a nutshell. So draft AQMP was released in early May. We had over 2 month period that we were receiving comment from the public. And then based on those public comments, we revised AQMP, and that's revised draft AQMP is called, and released early last month. And soon after, the CEQA process, draft program EIR, and socioeconomic impact on this assessment report has been released. Next slide. This is a high-level summary of comments has been received on the draft AQMP. Also, this reflects the stakeholders' comments that has been raised throughout the AQMP development process. So there were concerns and questions about general approach on the AQMP, why we are doing what we are doing, and then the need for federal actions, how to make them engaged, what we are doing to engage them to do their share of reductions, and black box measures, concerns on black box measures. And next slide. Since this AQMP also includes NOx reductions from commercial and residential buildings, stakeholders also raised the questions and concerns on the deployment of zero-emission technology in those building sectors, and also costs associated with the zero-emission technologies in building sectors, and whether we have solid enough infrastructure to support such a deployment, and how this will affect how this will be implemented in the context of environmental justice and equity. Next slide. Health effect is included in Appendix 1 of this AQMP. So to review this health effect associated with air pollutants, we formed advisory council. So far, there have been 2 meetings. And then this specific health effect analysis is under revision per the council's comments. Next slide. 5 policy briefing papers were developed to assist AQMP as well. And all these policy briefs are available on AQMP website for your review and comments. Next slide. All the supporting documents, including different versions of AQMP, meaning the draft AQMP, revised draft AQMP, public comments received on those 2 versions of AQMP, and also working group activities, presentations, agendas, and the advisory group activities, all of those supporting information is available on this website. Next slide. There are multiple ways the stakeholders can reach out to the staff and AQMP team, and then the information is given on this slide. Next slide. So the next step is we currently concluding regional public hearings. And as we mentioned, this AQMP will be considered at the South Coast AQMD's governing board meeting, which is tentatively scheduled on December 2nd. During this governing board meeting, still there will be opportunity for public the testimony and the stakeholders presenting your opinions and then comments. This will be followed by CARB's public hearing. This is another opportunity for public to express your opinions and comments on the AQMP, which is early next year, will be followed by submittal to EPA. This concludes my presentation for the first item, and thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Sang-Mi. A very good overview of the air quality management plan itself. We're going to turn now to hear a presentation from our colleagues at CARB. I'm very happy that we have Sylvia Vanderspeck here to walk through CARB's recently adopted state implementation plan strategy. So Sylvia, why don't you go ahead and take this next part?
All right, thank you, Ian. So good afternoon. My name is Sylvia Vandersbeck, and I'm Chief of the Air Quality Planning Branch at the Air Quality Planning and Science Today Division. And so today I plan to provide you a little bit of details regarding CARB's measures and the emission reduction commitment that's included in the 22 AQMP. And I just want to highlight really quickly that we've been working very closely with the South Coast staff on what is needed to meet the air quality standard in the South Coast. Next slide, please. So before I focus on the South Coast, I just want to highlight for you that the 70 parts per billion ozone standard is a challenge across the state, as you can see in this map. While some areas already met the standard in 2020, 10 areas still need to meet the standard in future dates and are required to submit SIPs, including the only extreme areas in the country and the most challenging areas, the San Joaquin Valley and the South Coast. 7 of these areas that you see on this map also need emission reduction commitments from the state of California. And so that's one of the reasons that we developed the 2022 state SIP strategy. Next slide. So last month, the CARB board approved the state measure commitments in the 2022 state SIP strategy. The strategy was developed through a robust public process and identifies the level of action needed to meet air quality standards and protect public health across the state. This strategy is going to drive the pace and scale of CARB rulemaking through the end of this decade. Specific to the South Coast, the strategies also identifies the actions the federal government needs to take to reduce emissions under their control. As Sammy mentioned earlier, without those reductions, the South Coast will have a very hard time to meet the standard. Next slide, please. The figure here shows the list of measures that CARB's going to be pursuing over the next decade. Some of them have been already adopted, such as the Clean Miles Standard regulation that requires cleaner cars for fleets like Uber and Lyft. Many are in the middle of their regulatory process. There are 2 regular regulations targeting heavy-duty trucks, the Advanced Clean Fleets, which will be heard for the first time at the CARB board meeting this month, and then the Zero Emission Truck Measure, which is later on in the schedule. We're also developing new motorcycle emission standards, and CARB's going to be pursuing a suite of off-road measures, as you can see on this chart, including a new off-road standard, zero emission requirements, and other regulation targeting sources that operate in the ports. CARB's in-use locomotive regulation is innovative and will provide significant reductions in the South Coast also. And I want to highlight also that CARB is ratcheting down on consumer products and developing a zero emission standards for space and water heaters. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, please click through the slides. Okay, thank you. So as I mentioned earlier, the board approved the list of measures last month. And so what this chart here shows is kind of the aggressive schedule that we're pursuing. And in order to get a commitment approved by EPA, you not only have to propose what the measure is, but you also have to provide a schedule. And so the stars on this schedule show when CARB will be required to consider the measure. And then the blue boxes show when these measures are going to be implemented. Next slide, please. As I talked about earlier, federal action is needed, especially from our federal partners. EPA is in the process of developing a low NOx standard for heavy-duty trucks. We think it could go lower, and we also think that EPA could work on a zero-emission engine standard in the future. For off-road, we think it's appropriate for them to develop a Tier 5 emission standard, along with requiring zero emission where feasible. And CARB continues to push EPA to adopt more stringent locomotive standards and address locomotives when they're remanufactured. For OGVs, we think there are opportunities for lower standard and cleaner fuels. And for aviation, we also see that opportunities for reduction from this sector. While these will be considered as black box actions, what's different is that the measures as they're written in the 2022 State SIP strategy clearly identified the path and what is needed and the opportunities for EPA to take action. Next slide, please. So, as Sang-Mi mentioned, the strategy does focus on NOx reduction. CARB's commitment includes over 89 tons per day of NOx reduction and almost 14 tons per day of VOC reductions. And those VOC reductions will provide near-term air quality benefits. Of the NOx reductions, 38 are coming from CARB measures that I had outlined previously, along with 167 tons per day of NOx reductions from our existing program. The remaining NOx reductions, about 51 tons, comes from those assignments from federal sources, and which will be approved as black box measures, with a significant portion coming from the ocean-going vessels and the aircrafts. Next slide, please. Click. Thank you. So next, CARB will be approving the South Coast SIP in January. When we adopt that SIP in January, we are also going to be approving the aggregate commitment that I talked about earlier. As soon as the CARB board adopts it, we will be transmitting the plan to US EPA. And then over the next 15 years, we will be working on all of these regulatory development and implementation of the measures here. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sylvia. I appreciate that overview of a very important effort happening at the state that is really critical for us to meet our air quality needs down here in South Coast. So really appreciate your overview there. So we've gotten through two important documents that lay out the strategy over the next few decades on different control measures to meet the 2015 ozone standard. Next, we have two presentations coming up looking at assessing the impact of those control measures. So first one, we're going to talk about the potential environmental impacts associated with those measures. So I see we have Kevin Nee here. So Kevin, why don't you go ahead and take this next part?
All right, thank you, Ian. Okay, well, as Ian mentioned, I'm the CEQA Air Quality Specialist for South Coast AQMD, and I will be giving a brief overview of the draft Program Environmental Impact Report prepared for the 2022 AQMP. Next slide, please. So the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, was adopted as law in 1970. It is primarily an information disclosure document, both for decision makers and the public, to lay out the potential significant environmental impacts of a proposed project and to list feasible mitigation measures and alternatives. Next slide, please. The 2022 AQMP is subject to CEQA, and because it encompasses the actions that the South Coast AQMD will undertake in the next 4 years, it is evaluated under Program EIR. This is an overarching analysis, and so rules, regulations, plans, and other projects will be individually further analyzed in the future and will tier off this document. Next slide, please. We previously finished the Notice of Preparation of an Initial Study, NOPIS phase, which is in the dark blue arrow and box to the left. We're currently in between the gold and the light blue box, and South Coast AQMD has released its draft Program EIR. And this document includes a more in-depth analysis of the environmental topics determined in the NOPIS to be potentially significant. And it also includes a response to all comments received on the NOPIS. Once the public comment period for the draft Program EIR ends on November 1st, we will work on the final Program EIR, which will address any and all comments from the draft Program EIR and show any updates to the analysis. Finally, in the light blue white arrow and box, the governing board will be considering certifying this final Program EIR in December. Next slide, please. So our draft Program EIR follows the traditional structure with a short and sweet executive summary in Chapter 1, followed by full-length discussions in Chapters 2 through 5. So for those who are wanting an in-depth analysis, say on air quality, I would direct you to first review Chapter 1 and then jump to the specific subchapter in Chapter 4 for air quality. Next slide, please. So as mentioned previously, the draft program EIR goes more in depth into environmental topic areas that were previously analyzed in the NOPIS and determined to be potentially significant. This is in the white box at the bottom left of the corner. And so the areas of air quality and greenhouse gas emissions, energy, hazards and hazardous materials, hydrology and water quality, noise, and solid and hazardous waste were determined to be potentially significant and further evaluated. Also in the draft program EIR, we analyzed 4 alternatives, including the no project alternative. Next slide, please. So overall, we do expect that implementation of the 2022 AQMP to achieve long-term air quality and greenhouse gas emissions benefits, primarily through NOx and GHG reductions. On the path to get there, however, we do expect impacts in the various environmental topic areas previously mentioned, such as air quality impacts during construction of new control devices, more efficient technology and infrastructure, and even short-term GHGs from production of electricity and alternative fuels. We also estimate energy impacts due to electricity, natural gas, and hydrogen demand. And then just moving through the different environmental topic areas all the way down to solid and hazardous waste impacts relating to landfill capacity from the removal of certain items from these projects. Out of an abundance of caution, even though we identified feasible mitigation measures for potential significant environmental impacts, we did conclude that significant impacts would remain. Next slide, please. So the draft program EIR was released for 46-day public review on September 16, 2022, and this public comment period ends on November 1st, 2022. If you would like to access the document, it's available online at the link listed on this slide. And if you would like a hard copy, you can arrange to pick up one at South Coast AQMD headquarters. Next slide, please. And so we definitely do encourage public to review and comment on this draft program EIR. And similar to the NOPIS phase, I will be compiling all the feedback we receive. So my contact information, email, and fax is listed here. And you can also call us as well. Next slide, please. And so I participated in review of the draft program EIR alongside my superiors. And so our contact information is listed on this slide from Michael Kraus, Barbara Radlin, and myself. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. Appreciate that information. So we now move on to our final presentation before we move on to the public comment portion of today's hearing. So we have done an assessment of the potential socioeconomic impacts from the revised draft air quality management plan. And so we have here Dr. Elaine Shen to provide an overview of that report. So go ahead, Elaine.
All right, thank you, Ian, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elaine Shen. I'm Planning and Rules Manager, overseeing the preparation of our socioeconomic report for 2022 AQMP. Next slide, please. And so just to provide everybody with some background, we have conducted a socioeconomic impact assessment for every AQMP since 1991, so over 3 decades already. And even though this assessment is not legally required, and unlike our rulemaking efforts, where we are required to prepare socioeconomic assessment, but we do prepare this socioeconomic report for every round of AQMP, and the purpose is in order to better inform the members of our public and also our policy makers, including the South Coast AQMD governing board members. And in this report, similar to our program EIR, we also have an executive summary in order to provide that high-level overview of our key findings of our various analysis. And in the ensuing chapters, we take a deeper dive into a variety of topics. And at the end of the report, we also provide technical appendices. So this is for readers who would like to get more technical details about the analysis that we conducted for our socioeconomic report. Next slide, please. So we released our draft socioeconomic report on October 1st. And in this report, we analyze the health benefits, associated costs of implementing the 2022 AQMP, and all the related macroeconomic impact and also environmental justice impacts of implementing the revised draft 2022 AQMP. And so the document is currently open for public comment period, and the period will end on November 2nd. And if you have not had the chance to check out these reports and appendices, we encourage you to go to that hyperlink that is listed on this slide here. And when you click into the link, and you will get to the page where on top, at the top of the page, you will see what's shown here in the little rectangular box. And so there are 3 links there. The first link, if you click into it, it will be our main socioeconomic report, the draft report. And the second link will take you to the technical appendices. And the third link at the bottom is going to take you to the public comment submission form, where you can use this form to easily sending us your comments. But if you would like to send us a separate comment letter in PDF or in other forms, please also feel free to send it via email to socioecon@aqmd.gov. Next slide, please. And so during the development of our draft socioeconomic report, we have continued to engage and involve our stakeholders and members of the public via our public processes. So since November 2021, last year, until this month, we have conducted 4 different scientific, technical, and modeling peer review advisory group meetings discussing various socioeconomic related topics. And this is in addition to the STMPR meetings that we also have that focus more on the air quality modeling side of things. And back in May, we presented at 3 scoping sessions during our regional public workshops. And so this month, including today, we present our socioeconomic findings at our regional public hearings. And earlier this month, on October 7th, we also provided a presentation to our South Coast AQMD Governing Board in order to present that key findings of our socioeconomic report analysis. Next slide, please. So from this slide onwards, I will be discussing the key findings of our report. So in terms of the incremental costs of implementing the revised draft 2022 AQMP, you will see at the bottom of this table that we estimated on an annual basis, and the annual average incremental cost would be about $2.85 billion a year. And about close to 57% of that 2.85 annual average, they're associated with a suite of mobile source control measures that are included in this 2022 AQMP, with the remainder of them, of the cost associated with the stationary and also area source control measures. And you will also see on this table that about 10% of the total cost are associated with measures that are incentive-based. And so the idea of this is that we will be partially relying on these incentives to help the regulated communities, including businesses, households, and other consumers, to offset some of the total costs that we just mentioned, that totaling $2.85 billion a year. And I also wanted to add that 10% of incentive funding is conservative, because we do know that there are parallel federal, state, and also local efforts that might add additional funding, incentive funding, to help us to get to the clean air goals, and other, as well as other nationwide and also state goals. Next slide, please. And so on this slide, I want to provide a more detailed breakdown of the annual costs and also the associated NOx reductions that we projected for year 2037. And so on the left-hand side of this slide, you will see this pie chart that shows you the idea about how the different control measures are contributing to the annual cost. And so you will see that at the darker blue slices of the pie, about 50% of the annual cost are associated with various control measures that are proposed by CARB, either for CARB to implement it directly, or they are proposed as part of the actions that can be taken by the federal government in order to help our region to reach our clean air goals. And on the right-hand side of this pie chart, you will see that for the 50% of the cost for mobile source control measures, you will also see that like relatively they account for about 75% of the NOx reductions that we're projecting for year 2037. And so on the flip side of that this proportions, you will also notice that for the stationary source and also area source control measures, they are relatively more expensive, but resulting in relatively fewer or less emission reductions that are being projected. And an important factor behind this seemingly misalignment is because a lot of those sources, especially for large industrial stationary sources, a lot of them that are already being tightly controlled with our existing regulations and rules that are being implemented by South Coast AQMD. So because we need to pursue all feasible measures in order to help our region to achieve that attainment goal, we need to look at all feasible actions that can be taken. In order to achieve the additional emission reductions from these sources that are already tightly controlled, we are looking into the deployment of zero emission technologies for these sources. And a lot of them, they have very high energy demand. And compared to the conventional combustion-based technologies, as of today, that zero emission-based technologies are still projected to be more expensive than these conventional technologies. And that is the reason why you see that proportionally or relatively more expensive control measures on the stationary and also area source side of things. Next slide, please. And compared to that 2.85 billion of annual incremental costs that we just discussed earlier on previous slides, and so in comparison to that, we are projecting about close to $20 billion a year of monetized public health benefits that can be realized by implementing our revised draft 2022 AQMP control measures. And you can see on this table that the majority of those estimated public health benefits that are associated with reduced long-term exposure to both ozone and PM2.5 or fine particulate matter pollution. But then a non-negligible portion of the health benefits that are also associated with morbidity-related benefits, such as avoided onset of asthma or asthma attacks, avoided cardiovascular symptoms, or other workloads and school load stays. And all of those, they can be monetized for us to understand how much benefits that would be. Next slide, please. And this slide, I want to take a deeper dive into the potential health effects or health benefits that are associated with avoided premature deaths throughout our region. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you will see a special distribution of the cases of avoided premature deaths that we're projecting that are either due to reduced long-term ozone exposure or reduced long-term PM2.5 exposure. On the right-hand side, you will see that the estimated numbers are tabulated in this table. And it also shows that the different regional distribution across the counties, how the numbers look like. So by year 2037, we're estimating that close to more than 3,000 cases of avoided premature deaths for our region. Next slide, please. And in order to ensure that the benefits of reduced air pollution and the associated health benefits are equitably distributed among our EGA and also non-EGA communities. So EGA stands for environmental justice. And we also conducted an environmental justice analysis to look at that distribution of the benefits. And in order to understand that or conduct the EGA analysis, firstly, we have to define what we mean by EGA communities. And so in our analysis, the main definition that we are relying on is consistent with the Senate Bill 535 definition of disadvantaged communities. And so that's our definition number 3 here on this table. But in order to look at alternative definitions and to sensitivity test that definitions, we also look at definition number 1 and number 2, where we are giving a little bit more weight to the air quality indicators that contribute to the overall EGA scores for us to designate the EGA communities. But you can see on this table that it does not really matter which definition we use. So in general, we're seeing more benefits accrued to the EGA communities when compared to the non-EGA communities. Next slide, please. And in terms of the job impact analysis, that's also part of our draft socioeconomic report. We look at the projected job impacts associated with the incremental costs that we discussed earlier in my presentation. So those job impacts are shown in blue bars here on this chart. And the projected job impacts associated with the health benefits that we discussed, they are being shown in green bars here on this slide. So when we combine both costs and benefits together, and the net job impacts are shown in the purple dashed line here. And so overall, on an annual average, we're projecting about 17,000 jobs foregone, but compared to the whole economy of more than 10 million jobs, it's relatively a small portion. And despite the forecasted jobs foregone for between year 2023 and year 2037, we're still estimating and projecting that our region will remain on the positive job growth trajectory of 0.27% of annual job growth. Next slide, please. And so what are the next steps for our AQMP socioeconomic report? As I mentioned earlier, we released that report on October 1st, 2022 this year. And so we're currently conducting the regional public hearings, and the report is open for public comments until November 2nd. So after taking into account all the comments and suggestions that all of you provide to us, so we're going to release our draft final socioeconomic report. In that report, we'll also include our staff responses to all the comments that are being provided to us. And on December 2nd, 2022, the whole 2022 AQMP package will be, including the draft the draft final socioeconomic report, will be brought to our South Coast AQMD Governing Board for the public hearing that day. Next slide, please. And so if you have any comments or questions or suggestions for our draft socioeconomic report, please feel free to reach out to Brian Velocich, who is on my staff in the Socioeconomic Analysis Unit, or reach out to myself directly. And if you have any general questions related to our AQMP, or you have any inquiries, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Sammy Lee or Ian McMillan here. So again, at the bottom of this slide, you will see that hyperlink that will take you to our report appendices and also our public comment submission form. Or again, you can just email us directly at socioecon@aqmd.gov. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Elaine. Appreciate you going through that really important assessment that we conduct on our air quality management plans on the socioeconomic impact. So it's a whole lot of information we've just presented here. We appreciate everyone's patience as we've gone through it. We wanted to make sure to work comprehensively through all of the major components of this air quality management plan and what we're going to be bringing to our board in December. At this point, we're now going to pivot to the public comment portion of today's regional public hearing. This is really, in my opinion, the most important part, where we get to hear feedback and comments from the public on everything that we just presented here and all the documents and materials. So if anybody wants to make public comment, they can click on the raise hand button at the bottom of their screen on Zoom, and then we'll go ahead and call your name. And then if you're on the phone, you can hit *9 to indicate that you'd like to make comment, and we'll call out your a small portion of your phone number. So I see a couple people have raised their hands so far. So first hand that I see here is Stan Young. You have a comment?
Yes, I have a comment. Is my time starting? Oh, okay. My name is Stan Young. I'll present a summary first. I'll give you expert advice. I'll present a claim of no air quality health effects in California and the South Coast Basin. You sit between CARB and your citizens, so you should be somewhat independent. I am an expert, 50 years of doing statistical analysis for 3 organizations. I've supervised over 10 PhD students spread over 4 universities. I have multiple publications in air quality and health effects. I'm a fellow of the American Statistical Association and also a fellow of AAAS. I served on the EPA SAB for 3 years and was appointed for another term. I've studied a massive California data set. The years were 2000 to 2012, 8 air basin, 37,000 exposure days, access to 2 million electronic death certificates. There were no effects of PM 2.5 or ozone on all-cause respiratory or cardiovascular mortality. I looked specifically at South Coast Air Basin. There were no effects there either. We made our data set public so that people could look at what we've done. What should you do? The charge committee should read my National Association of Scholars Shifting Sands report. This report covers all aspects of air pollution and health effects. 153 pages, 219 footnotes, 5 appendices, and over 220 references. We prove, in quotes, that there are no effects. We look very carefully, we scan the literature. We show how researchers got their flawed results. There are many flawed results in this area. Importantly, you should get your own data. California years 2013 to 2021. Make the data set public. This can be done because you're using daily deaths and that protects personal identity. Hire your own statistician. Don't depend on the literature. Have them present the results to you with visual things. I thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you very much for your comments. I see I have another speaker with a hand raised, Mike McCarthy. Did you have any public comment?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Mike McCarthy. I'm the sole proprietor at Radical Research LLC. I'm an adjunct professor at Pitzer College and a member of a community group called Riverside Neighbors Opposing Warehouses. I'd first like to thank the Air Quality Management District for putting this AQMP together. I want you to know that I think the AQMD staff are doing the best job that they can to improve air quality within the constraints they are given. So please take these comments as coming from a place of love for the work that you do and for our region and for a desire to improve air quality. However, I think this AQMP is a fundamentally disappointing plan to improve air quality in our region. It is extremely frustrating to see the AQMD hide the impacts of local emissions activity and fail to lead and account for the collective actions of local land use planning agencies that are undermining regional air quality goals by growing emissions activity of trucks, planes, boats, and trains at 3 to 6 times the rate of population growth. An emissions inventory is made of 2 parts: emissions rates, the amount of stuff coming out of the tailpipe, and emissions activity, the amount of tailpipes on the road. So if we have 1 truck on the road and we put an emissions control measure on it and we make it have half as much emissions of NOx, then we've have the emissions of NOx per mile. But if we put a second truck on the road and it also has the same control measure, we cancel it out. And this air quality management plan is fundamentally a whole bunch of controls to control air quality and a whole bunch of growing emissions. The AQMP emissions control measures almost exclusively focus on the options technologically to reduce the emissions rate. And there's the most cost-effective method to address future emissions is to reduce emissions rate growth. Trucks, planes, boats, and trains are projected by the AQMP to grow at rates 3 to 6 times the rate of population. If there was collective action by the local land use agencies that are permitting warehouses and the ports to cut back these growth rates to sustainable levels that mirror the rate of population, we'd save 20 tons of NOx per day. That would be much less expensive than the controls that are required at now. They are free, essentially, because we're just not growing, okay? So additionally, the fewer trucks, planes, boats, and trains would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They reduce emissions of diesel PM, which disproportionately affect environmental justice communities sited near the roads, ports, warehouses, and intermodal terminals. And it would reduce cancer risk. It is a win-win, win-win scenario. And yet there is no discussion of it in this air quality management plan. I know in the comments that you sent back to us that you said that the SCAG has regulatory authority over this, but there is nothing preventing you from mentioning that this is an option for emissions demand management, that you can actually achieve our air quality management plan goals by coordinating with our local air quality management districts. It is something you do with the federal government. You have no control over their regulatory choices, but you do exhort them to do their part. So I'd like you to ask our local land use planning agencies to do their part. We can all do our part. Thank you very much for your time today.
Great, thank you very much for your comment, Mike. I do want to keep opening this up to see if there are additional public comments. Again, if you wanted to make public comment, you can click on the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on a phone and wanted to make public comment, you can dial *9 and we'll see that you have your hand raised via phone. So I want to definitely keep opening this up and see as people keep thinking and digesting what has been shown today, or you think about other issues as you've been reviewing this, feel free to raise your hand and we can accept your comment. I also do want to note that we are going to be bringing this item to our board, or we're planning to bring this item to our board in December, on December 2nd, as you've heard. And there is still going to be opportunity to have your voice be heard with our board as well at that public hearing. We've also presented a bunch of different staff's contact information on the various reports that you've heard here, so that if you wanted to reach out individually, you can do so. I do want to again just give us one last call to see, are there any additional public comments that anybody would like to make on anything that we've heard today? And stretch it out one last little bit here. See any other last call public comment? Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any additional hands raised. Thank you for the comments that we did receive both in this hearing today and then in previous hearings. So speaker hand went up briefly on one phone number and then went back down. So maybe that was a mistake. But we had some public comment in our previous hearings as well. All of these hearings are posted on our website, on our webcasts. And so if you wanted to go back and review any of the other previous comments, the content is largely the same across all of the different regional hearings. But if you wanted to skip to the end and hear the public comments, you can go ahead and do so and find that there on our website. With that, I'm going to thank staff for all of their work to bring these regional hearings together, bring all the materials together and the presentations, and then also thank the public for attending and providing thoughtful feedback as we've gone through this. And I think at this point, we're going to go ahead and conclude the meeting. And